Some disasters roar into history, others creep in silence and kill before anyone even realizes what's happening. A single plutonium sphere killed 2 brilliant scientists in agony. A quiet African lake unleashed an invisible gas cloud that suffocated entire villages. And in London, the air itself turned to poison, killing thousands in just 5 days. These are not legends. They are real scientific accidents that forever changed how we see nature, technology, and ourselves. Lake Nyos, the silent killer. Lake Nyos in Cameroon looked peaceful, a perfect volcanic lake surrounded by green hills. But on August 21, 1986, it became one of the strangest natural disasters in recorded history. Deep beneath the lake's calm surface, carbon dioxide gas had been building up for decades. Trapped under intense pressure, it waited for one small trigger. A landslide, a tremor, maybe even a change in water temperature. Then, suddenly it happened. In a single instant, the deep waters erupted. A massive invisible cloud of coal burst upward, raced across the lake, and spilled over its edges like a toxic wave. Because the gas is heavier than air, it flowed downhill invisibly into nearby villages. Within minutes, 700 people were dead. Entire families died mid-step, as if time itself had stopped. Cattle, birds, and wildlife collapsed in the fields. Even insects were gone. There was no fire, no flood, no warning, only silence. When rescuers arrived the next morning, the scene was surreal. People and animals frozen where they stood, as though they had fallen asleep. Scientists later called it a limnic eruption, a rare natural event where lakes suddenly release trapped gases with explosive force. To prevent another silent apocalypse, engineers installed degassing tubes that vent salve from deep underwater. Since then, they've identified other dangerous lakes in Africa and Asia and installed similar systems. Lake Nyos was a grim reminder that the world's deadliest forces aren't always loud or visible. Sometimes death moves quietly and breathes. The Demon Core death in the Flood in 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a third atomic bomb core sat unused at Los Alamos. A 14-pound sphere of plutonium small enough to hold, powerful enough to annihilate a city. It was nicknamed the Demon Core. On August 21, 1945, a young physicist named Harry Daghlian worked alone, performing an experiment that had already been deemed dangerous. He was stacking tungsten carbide bricks around the plutonium, materials that reflected neutrons back into the core, pushing it closer to a nuclear chain reaction. One brick slipped, it fell onto the core, and the room erupted in a flash of blue light and heat. Harry reacted instantly, knocking the brick away. But it was too late. In seconds, he'd received a lethal dose of radiation. Over the next 25 days, his body fell apart from the inside. His hand blistered and blackened. His internal organs failed one by one. He slipped into a coma and died, the first victim of the Demon Core. 9 months later, scientists were still using the same sphere. They called their tests "tickling the dragon's tail." They knew the danger, they just couldn't resist it. On May 21, 1946, another physicist, Louis Slotin, gathered 7 colleagues for a live demonstration. He used 2 beryllium half-spheres, manually separating them with nothing but a screwdriver. If the tool slipped and the shells closed around the plutonium, the reaction would go critical. And then it did. The screwdriver slipped, the spheres snapped shut. A brilliant blue flash filled the room. Slotin didn't freeze. He reacted instantly, ripping the spheres apart with his bare hands, saving everyone else in the room, but condemning himself. He knew immediately what had happened. He calmly instructed each scientist to mark their position, calculating even in agony who would live and who would die. 9 days later he was gone. After that, Los Alamos finally melted down the Demon Core. 2 scientists dead, 1 glowing sphere of plutonium, retired forever. The great smog of London, the city that choked in the winter of December 1952. London, the world's largest and most powerful city at the time, became a tomb of its own making. The familiar gray fog that rolled through the streets turned darker, thicker, heavier. At first, people barely noticed. Londoners had lived with fog for generations, even given it a name, supers, thick with soot and coal smoke. But this one was different. It began on December 5th, when an unusual cold front settled over the Thames Valley. The air was completely still. Normally, the city's smoke from coal fires would rise and disperse into the atmosphere. But a temperature inversion trapped it close to the ground. The result was a suffocating blanket of soot, tar, and sulfur dioxide, a toxic soup mixed with the city's endless furnace exhaust. Within hours, London was swallowed by a yellow, gray fog so dense that people couldn't see their own hands. Traffic stopped. Buses broke down mid-route. Theaters closed because audiences couldn't see the stage. The darkness wasn't just visual, it was physical. Soot settled into lungs, into homes, onto food. At first, Londoners treated it like an inconvenience. They walked to work with scarves over their mouths. They joked about another bad fog. But by the second day, the coughing began. The fog grew thicker, carrying a sharp, metallic taste. The air stung the eyes. Hospitals began filling with people struggling to breathe. The very young, the elderly, and those with asthma or bronchitis. By the third day, panic set in. Visibility dropped to less than 1 meter. Ambulances couldn't navigate the streets. People fell into the Thames, disoriented. Drivers crashed into walls and one another, unable to see beyond their headlights. Trains stopped entirely. Funeral homes overflowed with victims. Doctors reported a terrifying pattern. Patients arriving with severe respiratory failure, lips blue, lungs filled with toxic sludge. Animals died in the streets. Farmers near London found their livestock choking in open fields. Even indoors, people weren't safe. The poisonous air seeped through doors and windows, staining wallpaper and curtains with grime. By the time the fog finally lifted on December 9th, the scale of the tragedy was beyond comprehension. More than 4,000 people were dead within days, but later studies suggested the true number may have been closer to 12,000 once delayed respiratory complications were counted. Tens of thousands more were hospitalized or suffered lifelong lung damage. Scientists eventually confirmed what many feared. This wasn't a freak weather event. It was man-made. The endless burning of low-grade sulfur coal for heat, factories belching smoke, and the government's failure to regulate pollution had created the perfect killer. The Great Smog of 1952 became a turning point in environmental awareness. The outrage that followed forced Parliament to act, passing the Clean Air Act of 1956, the first legislation in Britain to control smoke emissions and promote cleaner fuels. Chimneys were redesigned, coal was regulated, and smokeless zones were created. It was the disaster that forced humanity to face an uncomfortable truth: we had poisoned our own sky. In the decades that followed, scientists would look back on those 5 days as the moment when modern environmentalism was born. Not from ideals, but from suffocation. The Great Smog of London wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning, a reminder that progress without responsibility can turn the very air we breathe into a weapon. Seveso, the chemical cloud, it began like any other summer morning in northern Italy, but by the afternoon of July 10, 1976, the small town of Seveso would become the site of one of Europe's worst chemical disasters, one that no one saw coming, because death arrived invisible. The Eichmesse chemical plant sat on the outskirts of town, producing trichlorophenol, a compound used to make disinfectants and pesticides. Inside one of its reactors, a chain reaction went out of control. Pressure built rapidly, and then, with a violent hiss, a safety valve burst open, releasing a massive cloud of gas into the sky. The gas drifted silently over the countryside. There was no explosion, no fire, no noise. People looked up, saw nothing, and carried on with their day. But in that cloud was dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known to science, a chemical so potent that microscopic traces can alter human DNA. Hours later, the first signs appeared. Birds fell from the sky, leaves curled black, cats and dogs died in the streets. And then, the children. Parents rushed their kids to hospitals as mysterious rashes appeared on their faces and arms. Large, blistered sores that burned and bled. Doctors were baffled until they realized what they were seeing: chloracne, a skin condition caused by chemical poisoning. It took nearly a week before authorities admitted what had happened. By then, the damage was irreversible. The cloud had spread across a several-kilometer radius, contaminating soil, gardens, and farms. Milk, fruits, and vegetables were declared unsafe. Entire neighborhoods were evacuated, their homes abandoned. Thousands of animals, goats, pigs, chickens, were slaughtered to prevent contaminated meat from entering the food chain. The people of Seveso lived in fear, not just of what they could see, but of what they couldn't. Dioxin doesn't disappear. It lingers in soil and human tissue for decades. Women were advised not to have children for years after exposure, fearing birth defects, and the psychological scars ran even deeper than the physical ones. In the years that followed, doctors documented elevated rates of cancer, liver damage, and reproductive disorders among Seveso residents. The disaster transformed how Europe viewed industrial safety. Outrage turned into reform. By 1982, the European Union passed the Seveso Directive, a comprehensive law requiring all chemical plants to implement strict safety protocols, emergency plans, and community evacuation systems. To this day, any facility handling hazardous materials in Europe is still governed by those same rules. Named after the quiet town that was poisoned by the wind. The Seveso disaster didn't explode like Chernobyl or Bhopal. It didn't leave flames or shattered buildings. Its terror was invisible, drifting, and silent. It showed that the greatest industrial dangers aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes, the most devastating killers arrive on a calm summer afternoon, carried gently through the air. Seveso remains a haunting symbol of modern progress. A town that learned the hard way that the line between creation and contamination is thinner than smoke. Minamata, the poisoned sea in the 1950s, the Japanese fishing town of Minamata lived and breathed by the water. But the sea that fed them was slowly killing them. For years, the Chiso Corporation had been dumping methylmercury into the bay, a potent neurotoxin invisible in the water, but deadly inside living things. Fish absorbed it, then cats, then people. At first, villagers noticed cats acting strangely, twitching, stumbling, convulsing before dying. Soon, people began showing the same symptoms: numbness, tremors, slurred speech, blindness. Babies were born with severe deformities and brain damage. It took years before the company admitted responsibility, and even longer before victims received compensation. By then, thousands had suffered irreversible neurological damage. Today, Minamata disease stands as a symbol of environmental negligence, a warning that what we dump into nature always finds its way back. The thalidomide tragedy in the late 1950s, the world was entering an age of optimism. Science was advancing faster than ever. New medicines, vaccines, and technologies promised to eliminate the suffering of the past. It was an era that believed in progress and trusted those who sold it. So, when a German pharmaceutical company introduced a new drug called thalidomide, doctors called it a miracle. The small, harmless-looking pills promised to cure insomnia, anxiety, and especially morning sickness, the nausea that plagued pregnant women during early pregnancy. It was marketed as perfectly safe. The company claimed there was no risk of overdose, no side effects, and certainly no danger to unborn children. In a time when medical oversight was minimal, thalidomide was handed out like candy, prescribed in Europe, Australia, and parts of North America, and sold over the counter in some countries without a prescription at all. Women trusted their doctors. Doctors trusted the companies, and the companies trusted the profits. Then, the horror began. By the early 1960s, hospitals across Germany, Britain, and Japan began to notice a disturbing pattern. Babies were being born with shocking deformities. Arms that ended in tiny flippers. Legs fused together. Missing fingers, ears and eyes. Internal organs malformed beyond recognition. Some infants lived only hours, others survived but would spend their lives in wheelchairs or hospitals. Doctors were baffled. At first, they suspected infection or radiation exposure. Anything but a drug supposedly safe enough to take during pregnancy. But then, a few courageous physicians began connecting the dots. The mothers of these children all had one thing in common: they had taken thalidomide. The evidence grew overwhelming. The drug, it turned out, interfered with the development of blood vessels in embryos. When taken during early pregnancy, even for a short time, it stopped limbs and organs from forming properly. Still, the pharmaceutical companies refused to take responsibility. They insisted it was coincidence. They questioned the science. They hired lawyers to silence doctors. And all the while, new mothers continued to take the pills, unaware of the nightmare waiting for their unborn children. By the time thalidomide was finally pulled from shelves in 1961, the damage was irreversible. More than 10,000 children in 46 countries had been affected. Thousands more likely died before birth, their deformities unrecorded. The tragedy shattered public trust in medicine. The outrage that followed changed the world. Governments demanded answers. Lawsuits began to pile up, forcing pharmaceutical companies into the spotlight. The trials were ugly, revealing a web of greed, negligence, and scientific arrogance. But something powerful emerged from the ashes. Modern drug regulation was born. After thalidomide, every new medication faced rigorous testing, including mandatory studies on pregnant animals and far stricter human trials. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration tightened its review process, and other countries followed suit. No longer would a company's word be enough to declare a drug safe. Thalidomide left behind a generation of survivors. Men and women born without limbs, many of whom became activists, lawyers, and advocates for medical ethics. Their suffering forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth: that blind faith in science, without accountability, is as dangerous as ignorance. The thalidomide tragedy was not just a medical disaster. It was a moral one, a warning written in scars. It was too late for one generation of children, but their pain built the foundation of modern safety standards. Because of them, millions of others were spared the same fate. The Bhopal gas tragedy, December 2, 1984, Bhopal, India. In the dead of night, a faint hissing sound began echoing through the quiet streets surrounding the Union Carbide pesticide plant. Few paid attention. The air smelled faintly of metal and burning chili, strange, but not alarming. Then, within minutes, the city began to choke. A dense, invisible cloud of methyl isocyanate gas, MAM-IC, had begun leaking from one of the plant's massive storage tanks. The gas spread quickly, hugging the ground, rolling silently into the crowded slums that surrounded the factory. People woke up coughing, eyes burning, lungs on fire. Mothers clutched their children, stumbling through the dark, trying to escape. But the gas was everywhere, thick, suffocating, inescapable. Within hours, 800 people were dead. Cows, dogs, birds. Every living creature caught in the path collapsed where they stood. The hospitals were overwhelmed, unprepared for what was happening. No one knew what the gas was, how to treat it, or how to survive it. What caused this nightmare? Investigators later found that water had seeped into a storage tank containing 40 tons of methyl isocyanate. The chemical reacted violently with the water, raising pressure and temperature until it blew through safety valves. But the plant's emergency systems, refrigeration, scrubbers, and alarms, either weren't working or had been shut down to save money. It was a catastrophe born of negligence and greed. The tragedy didn't end when the sun rose. As dawn broke over Bhopal, the full horror was visible. Streets were littered with bodies. Survivors wandered in shock, their eyes red and blistered. Families searched for loved ones among piles of the dead. The aftermath was chaos. Hospitals ran out of oxygen and medicine. Doctors had no protective gear. Many of the victims who survived the first night died slowly in the days that followed, from lung damage, blindness, or organ failure. And then came the lies. Union Carbide executives downplayed the scale of the disaster. The company's American CEO fled India before he could face trial. Local officials blamed worker error. Victims waited decades for justice, trapped in endless legal battles while their water and soil remained poisoned. Even today, more than 40 years later, the land around the old factory remains contaminated with heavy metals and toxic waste. Children are still born with deformities. Cancer rates are higher than average. The people of Bhopal continue to suffer from the lingering shadow of that one terrible night. The official death toll was around 3,800, but researchers estimate that between 15,000 and 20,000 people may have ultimately died from the gas and its long-term effects. It remains one of the deadliest industrial disasters in history. Bhopal changed everything. The world could no longer pretend that corporate negligence was just an accident. Governments demanded accountability. International regulations for hazardous chemical plants were rewritten. Companies were forced to adopt emergency response plans and stricter maintenance protocols. But the people of Bhopal still live with the consequences, not just in their bodies, but in their memories. The night of December 2, 1984, was more than a tragedy. It was a warning that the pursuit of profit, when stripped of responsibility, can destroy entire cities. And long after the gas cleared, the smell of it, sharp, metallic, and merciless, stayed in the air, as if reminding the world what happens when safety becomes secondary to cost. Because that night, Bhopal didn't just lose thousands of lives. It lost its breath. Deepwater Horizon, the ocean on fire on April 20, 2010, the night sky above the Gulf of Mexico lit up like an inferno. The Deepwater Horizon, a massive offshore drilling rig owned by Transocean and leased by BP, had suffered a catastrophic pressure failure nearly a mile beneath the sea. Within seconds, a column of gas shot up the drill pipe, ignited, and exploded, turning the billion-dollar platform into a floating fireball. 11 workers were killed instantly. 17 more were severely injured. But the true disaster wasn't just the explosion. It was what came after. Deep beneath the surface, the Macondo wellhead had ruptured. Crude oil began gushing out at uncontrollable pressure, a black torrent erupting directly into the sea. BP's engineers scrambled to seal it, but nothing worked. For the next 87 days, the world watched in horror as millions of barrels of oil poured into the Gulf. Each passing day brought new footage of an ocean transformed into a sea of death. Black waves stretched across hundreds of miles, slicking coastlines in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. Seabirds struggled to fly, their feathers glued together by thick crude. Turtles and dolphins washed up lifeless. Coral reefs choked beneath the rising sludge. The blowout preventer, the rig's final safety mechanism, was supposed to stop this exact kind of disaster. It's a massive valve system, designed to seal the well in case of a pressure surge. But during the explosion, it malfunctioned. Whether through faulty design, poor maintenance, or pure bad luck, it failed to close. And with that failure, the ocean was left bleeding, and nothing could stop it. BP tried everything. They dropped heavy containment domes, lowered robotic submarines, pumped drilling mud and cement into the well. All failed. Underwater cameras broadcast the leak live, an unending stream of black oil spiraling into blue water, visible proof of humanity's worst nightmare, a wound in the planet itself. Meanwhile, onshore, thousands of cleanup workers rushed to contain the spreading slick. They scrubbed beaches, burned surface oil, and sprayed chemical dispersants into the sea. Chemicals that later caused burns, nausea, and respiratory illness among the very people sent to clean it up. Entire fishing industries collapsed overnight. as contaminated seafood and dead marine life crippled the Gulf's economy. Local families who had lived off those waters for generations suddenly found their livelihoods and their futures gone. The human cost was only the beginning. By the time the well was finally capped on July 15, 2010, an estimated 210 million gallons of crude oil had spilled, the largest marine oil spill in human history. BP faced worldwide outrage and billions in fines, but the ecological damage would last decades. The oil had seeped into coral reefs, deep-sea ecosystems, and marshlands, poisoning food chains at every level. Satellite images captured the dark stain stretching across the Gulf, a scar visible from space. Scientists called it the ocean's Chernobyl. It wasn't just an environmental catastrophe, it was a revelation of how fragile our technological confidence truly was. The Deepwater Horizon explosion forced governments and corporations to confront the risks of deep-sea drilling. A reminder that the quest for profit beneath the waves carries consequences far beyond what we can control. Years later, survivors of the rig still speak of that night, of fire raining from the sky, and the sound of the ocean itself burning. And though the flames eventually died, the Gulf never truly healed, because what burned that night wasn't just oil. It was trust. In technology, in safety, in control. The Deepwater Horizon didn't just spill oil, it exposed the truth that even the deepest oceans aren't safe from human hands. Sverdlovsk, the hidden anthrax outbreak. The year was 1979 in the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, deep inside the Soviet Union. It began quietly, with strange fevers appearing in factory workers near Compound 19, a secret military microbiology lab. Within days, people started collapsing on the streets, gasping for air, skin turning black around open sores. No one knew what was happening, and the government was determined to keep it that way. Sverdlovsk was part of the USSR's biological weapons program, a classified network of labs tasked with developing pathogens capable of mass destruction. Inside Compound 19, scientists were working with Bacillus anthracis, the bacteria that causes anthrax. It's one of the deadliest agents known to science. A microscopic spore that can survive for decades and kill within days of exposure. On April 2, 1979, something went terribly wrong. A technician forgot to replace a filter in the lab's ventilation system. For just a few hours, the unfiltered exhaust pumped a fine cloud of airborne anthrax spores out of the building and into the city's wind. The breeze carried it south, directly over nearby factories, residential blocks, and a military base.